It would be fair to say the tale and concept of gods is the story of humanity itself. Scores of cultures over all of recorded human history use the idea as an explanation for the question which makes us human: why? Whether the peaceful sunset or a bloody war, it became the justification for anything and everything. Whether this is good or bad is open to questioning. And FateZero takes a hearty stab at that question, presenting characters who utilize their faith in both traditional and atypical ways, most often for harmful or downright vile purposes. We'll be looking at them here today to examine the anime and see what it has to say about faith in humanity and what we can take from its message. Be warned for FateZero spoilers ahead as we get into things proper here. Castor and Ryuunosuke are both irredeemable monsters who committed gut-wrenching acts in the service of their own desires. But what's interesting about their desires is both of them crave something from God. Castor, or Gilles de Rais, committed atrocious acts in his time. He tortured and murdered children, doing unspeakable things in an attempt to prove the existence of a just God. As he explains, he wanted an act of divine retribution to strike him down, presenting clear as day that there was a God who existed, and one who took heed of his actions and had a love for humanity. He used hatred to try and find love. Continuing his acts for 8 years, he never found such proof. Instead, he claims he was put to execution by the church and state so they could acquire his land and wealth. His odd quest for love of a god led him to be killed by the followers of the same deity. So when he and Ryuunosuke return to their torture chamber to find, as they say, their art destroyed, they launch into a questioning of God where Castor reprimands the young man. He says with, in his eyes, definitive proof that God does not punish or care, so questioning him is a futile act. And there is some logic to what he says, even if it's rooted in the most twisted values and desires. But this logic is based entirely on interpretation. Let's look at the assumptions he applies to God. Firstly is that God is all-powerful. Because he believes he will see retribution for his actions, he must apply omnipotence to God. He will see these wrong actions and in his infinite wisdom apply a proper punishment. He has the ability to both see and affect the world. Included in our description there, he also makes the assumption that God is kind. He's on the side of good against evil, as traditional descriptions agree. Under those two assumptions, it's possible to reach the conclusion that God must not be real or must not be just, because he has failed one of those two principles we've determined he must possess. The logical conclusion is that God doesn't exist. This goes entirely against what he would have believed his entire life. As a companion of Jeanne d'Arc, the one he mistakes Saber for, it would be odd for him not to be a fervent believer in the same Lord as she followed. So when he reaches this conclusion, it's not just a simple idea that falls apart around him, it's his entire world. The path of religion is not one that just involves life, but the afterlife or reincarnation and so much more. It's a commitment of one's soul in many cases, as it was for him. Thus his belief in some sort of almighty led him to act against everything it stood for. Because committing unspeakable acts to test its existence was an easier path than accepting that it didn't exist. The former only requires he persists through the blood and gore, something he grew to love, while the latter demanded that he question the direction of his entire being, one which to him would include eternity. The stronger the belief, the further reaches people will go to defend it. This is the danger of a leader who can never be tested, a leader who exists outside of the followers, a leader who demands compensation now for benefits in the future with no guarantee other than the belief that was already required. Whatever you believe, God as an entity in any form and under any banner has no method to be proven or disproven. And with many interpretations, God will never be able to be disproven. Take for example the idea that all is part of God's plan, even atrocities like those committed by Castor. While they may be terrible actions, maybe in the grand scheme of things they prevented some greater evil. With that in mind, you can reason that the end, whatever that may be, will lead to some greater good than the evil it utilized. In this way, God becomes unfalsifiable. Any evidence against him is just part of the plan. This allows God to justify anything. And this is another assumption Caster could apply to flip his mindset and continue believing in a just God. It's all part of the plan. He knew these actions would happen and needed them for some reason. If the madman is not stopped, then he actually must be doing the Lord's work. Also, he failed to consider that maybe one of his assumptions was wrong. Maybe God isn't omnipotent and lacked the knowledge of what he was doing, or was using a limited amount of power to deal with other situations. Also, under his assumptions, we can argue that God does exist. Can we not look at his execution as an act of God? Maybe he played on the greed and hearts of man and used that to motivate those around Caster to uncover his dark secrets through other means. That's a scenario as likely as any other, but one that didn't fit with the narrative Caster had already crafted. He chose to follow a leader he could interpret whichever way he pleased. If he wanted to believe in a just God, he could have kept doing so. But it no longer fit with his own desires and path, so he cut out the belief in this new life. And we can see this in the fact that his actions during and after his belief don't differ. He just keeps doing what he was anyway, but under a new justification. God has no actual relevance to him. He simply wanted the freedom that comes with such a belief, a superior who can give any and all commands. A leader is the guiding principle one follows, which often determines their actions and the morality they apply to them. But what's the point when two people can see the same leader in a different way, each of equal truth? Interpretation of something so powerful holds inherent to itself danger. Ryuunosuke is an individual much like Caster, but one even more dangerous in his ideals. Caster didn't change, but he had the potential to at least. Ryuunosuke doesn't allow himself to question his principles at all, he just takes them as correct. His deepest desires just so happen to match up with exactly what God wants. How is a man in this mindset ever proved wrong? What that he does or is shown to him could ever make him believe something other than this? The same idea, which has been used for centuries to try and promote peace and love, is also used to justify ripping children away from their families and killing them before their very eyes. Ryuunosuke sees and enjoys the tragedy around him and has to explain its existence in some way. Disfiguring the traditional idea of God for his own beliefs allows him to do so. If he was performing his demented act of his own will, then maybe one day the pain would get to him and he could question his own actions. But would this day ever come when he sees them as a method of worship? This belief of God isn't a common one, but it shows the risk of interpretation quite well. His reasoning is all physical and weak. He says that
he loves screams and blood and utter despair just as much. If he didn't, there's just no way in hell the guts of living things would be as cool and colorful as they are.
And he uses a human construct of acting in justification as well, saying,
you know, the best entertainers will sometimes get the most acclaim of their careers when they play a really dark and disturbed villain.
These aren't facts or logical statements, but simply meek rebrandings of his own feelings. He doesn't even need some lengthy or meaningful reasoning to make God demented. Isn't that terrifying? They made up their minds on what they wanted to do and sought justification from there. All God, their interpretation, serve as is a means to do whatever they wanted under the banner of good. But what about the other side of the scale? We've seen those who use God to justify their actions, but what about inaction? Someone who blocks out all else but God, whether through fear, stagnation, or resolution. What about Kirei Kotomine? While he may be resolute, that's about the only positive word that we use to describe him. He's bland and boring, presenting no interest, no hint of personality, and no expression to match it all. He speaks monotone, only responding to the commands of others and hardly ever giving an input of his own. It's fitting that he received Assassin as his heroic spirit, a nameless, faceless servant whose existence held nothing unique. Him even having a servant is almost comical, given he takes no actions on his own behalf for a large portion of the series. He's relieved when Assassin dies and he has to leave the Grail War behind, not even excited by the thought of achieving any wish, saying,
I've finally been freed from a most unpleasant burden.
But this line in his delivery starts to reveal the cracks in his character. The pause where he carefully determines his words is telling. He does this often, many times also looking away before harshly denying any analysis of himself from others. Kirei is a man who actively represses every desire he may hold in the name of God. Most telling in his interactions with Gilgamesh, he says,
"Wish for joy? You'd ask me to long for something that blasphemous and sinful?"
he has defined life itself as a sin. This is where his resolution turns dangerous. He's not hurting anyone else yet, but because of his strict interpretation of God, his existence is nearly pointless. He has no real friends, no enjoyment in what he does, no anything. Acting only in service of others, namely God, he decides that he has no value. His pleasure, comfort, happiness, whatever it may be, in no way holds something of worth in his belief. These feelings which spur humanity to act in their own ways can only drive them further from God. And this extends beyond himself. He holds the same contention for the rest of humanity. He doesn't consider anything done in the anime to be with proper intentions. Kiritsugu aims to find the Grail and bring true peace. After fighting two women who would openly give their lives to see this goal accomplished, Kirei misses the mark on his read. He says that Kiritsugu is just another mercenary. A similar interaction happens with Kariya, who gives his life in the Grail War to try and save another. Kirei's read is that his goals are banal and it's only for absolution. He never judges the character of another properly. This is the result of his strict interpretation of God, a reason why he lacks a connection or understanding of anyone else. Humans can only act in selfish ways according to him, so when they have a goal rooted in some moral territory, he fails to see it as such. In a weird contradiction, his faith in the highest power of true good forces him to ignore actual good happening before his eyes. Similar to what we said of the ideal leader, Saber, last time, when perfection of some kind exists, or is presumed to exist, then what is everything that comes under it? They can never fulfill the heavy requirements of such a thing in this way, accentuated by Kirei. God does nothing more than cast a shadow of devolution over humanity. Much like Castor and Ryuunosuke, we can also see where Kirei uses God as an excuse, another danger of his interpretation. The reason he believes so strictly, takes to heart that all pleasure and joy is sinful, is because he's scared of his own desires. He simply didn't want to grow. When Gilgamesh asks why he defines joy as a sin, he can't answer. And then the heroic spirit goes on to show the subconscious desires that spill out of Kirei's actions. Deep down in his character is the desire to hurt others. After years of stifling his own desires, it manifests in the form of hurting them by crushing their deepest desires, as he does with Kariya. Since he has forced himself to have no desire, he now forced that to the rest of humanity. As Gilgamesh shows, this was implicit to his character, but shackled under his faith. Kirei used God as an excuse to look away from the depths of himself that he hated. Rather than work on his issues and become someone stronger, he feigned strength through his theistic resolve. This is the danger of his God, who forces humanity to give up all of their desires. We all hold desires we wish we didn't. Jealousy of things our friends have, a wish for attention, a want for tragedy so that we can be special, and so much more. Part of being human is hating things about humans. As a quick side note, if you want more on this idea, check out the card on screen now for our Wonder Egg priority video, which goes much more in depth into these ideas. But back to the topic of hand. Part of being human is also figuring out why we hate those things and what can be done about them. We don't erase them, but we learn to deal with those issues as they become smaller and smaller parts of a now larger person. Strict faith, in a sense, just a rebranding of denial, is the opposite. It ignores them and at the same time shrinks the person. All it does is eventually force unwanted desire to become the entire being. This is what we see in Kirei's ending. Once he gives in to his want to cause pain, he does nothing else. Because his character was so minuscule, the only defining factor of it is now this impulse. Faith created a monster. He never learned how to deal with not just that aspiration, but also how to control his own pleasure. In many ways, he's like a child who doesn't know how to stop eating candy before they get a stomachache. There's no temperance on his actions, and it shows in the Grail. It vaporizes his surroundings, causing total, unabashed destruction for no reason other than to do so. And we can see even less growth when we consider the Grail. You might be inclined to say that at least he cast off the plague of God in his life and could now expand into a new person, even if for the worse. But he simply chose a new god. In his final interactions with Kiritsugu, he rambles madly about the Grail's own desires and its wish for life, nothing about himself. Look at how much he pleads, not for himself, but for a wish-granting cup.
The Grail longs for a life of its own! Longs for its own birth! Please, don't kill it.
The only other time he was this angered was when Gilgamesh initially tells him to wish for joy, something he viewed as a sin and thus an affront to his god. He didn't move on, he didn't grow, he did nothing but shift the object of his faith. This is another consequence of his blind faith for so long, he knows no way to live outside of it. When the walls come crashing down, his natural response wouldn't be, well, I guess I was wrong, after so much time believing. It would be to prop up that belief in another way. And the Grail is a fitting target. It was the only object which for once could avoid his strict definition. When it forced the command seals back to him, it proved something against God's will. It told him to seek his own desires, something he himself knew but didn't want to accept. With blind faith, anything can usually be reasoned away as a test or part of the plan. Not many things we witness are powerful enough to shift that kind of mindset. Its pillars rest on things that can't be observed, so when things can be observed, they hold no power over it. Proof becomes a meaningless double-edged sword. But the Grail's decisions are something unobservable. We only see the end result, which was telling him to go against God. It proved itself more powerful, on level with, or an agent of the heavens. That's what allowed him to finally accept the worst version of himself. As we did with Castor and Ryuunosuke, I also want to look at some alternative assumptions that could provide evidence against Kirei's credence. He views pleasure and joy, things which drive humans to act on their own self-interest, as bad, since those impulses are not the will of God. But isn't it just as possible that as an all-powerful being, God created us with those desires in mind, so us chasing them is just an adherence to his will? Wouldn't that be the most natural way to see his wishes carried out, since it would mean that every human, regardless of faith, had the chance to be acting in the way he wished? There's also pleasure derived from moral actions. Some people volunteer their time and money to see the betterment of those with less than them, whether through a sense of duty or for a warm feeling they find in doing so. Even if we consider doing it just to feel good as a selfish action, that doesn't change the net result of their actions being positive. Pleasure doesn't have to lead to negative outcomes, but in his definition, helping others because it makes one feel good is something sinful. Is this something we want to believe is right in absolute terms? One of the issues with an interpretable leader is any number of assumptions can entirely shift the results of faith. At the end of the day, the assumptions made are probably nothing more than someone exerting their own idea of what God should be into the idea of God. Castor and Ryuunosuke crafted him in their minds as someone who would love the show they put on. To them, a fully valid explanation using the same concept as Kirei. To stifle his own desires, Kirei views God as one of harsh temperament who doesn't want humans to seek any happiness in life because that's what best allowed him to reconcile with himself and his upbringing in the church. In this way, believing in God is nothing more than excusing your own wishes in a way which removes the label of wish. It makes them feel not like selfish desires, but like inherently ethical goals. You cease to work for yourself, but instead for the greater good, while fulfilling the same desires you would have anyway. And as we see in FateZero, those goals can be terrible things. We spoke very negatively of the concept of God here today, but it's just as valid to look at situations where a belief in God would lead to something positive. In the same way the concept can create a justification for evil acts, it can also craft a greater drive for righteous ones. It can foster a devotion to a true, greater good. But at the end of the day, that's still the same as our last case. I believe that desire would already exist within the person who then explains it as a case of God. It's a tool to explain pre-held beliefs either way. That, even when considering good, is the danger of interpretation mixed with blind faith. The ability to justify anything fervently. That's why I personally have a hard time believing in anything which can't be proven in physicality. I love the idea of a soul, but no one can ever show one to me. I can only interpret things I see as evident for the concept. In that way, I could choose to believe in the idea of souls as a sort of God in its own right. Really, I can choose anything to be my God. So with all this in mind, rest assured that this isn't an attack on faith alone, but rather an attack on humanity through the lens of FateZero. I'd expect nothing less from Urobuchi, and I think media like this that forces us to question a belief is something endlessly valuable to us all. Being human is growing and changing, it's an undeniable fact of our physical beings. Whether we let that extend to our abstract selves, however, is up to us. And that is the note I would like to end things on here today. But first, I will go ahead and do some usual plugs because video outros on YouTube. In the top comment, I'll have 3 links to my Twitter, Discord, and Patreon if you want to reach me directly and keep up with me. Same thing on Discord, reach me directly or chat with some other anime fans. And the third one, the Patreon, if you want to support us directly and get your name at the end of videos here and just help improve the content. But if you can't give, there's always other ways to help. A like if you liked it, a dislike if you didn't, and a comment letting me know what you thought of the video, of the topic, any other animes you'd like to see me cover, because the best thing about doing this is getting to see what you all like about it or dislike about it as well, your thoughts on it, and really crafting some true discussion and a true community here, which is, as I always say, why I really love to do this. I'm sure I'm forgetting something else to plug, but I'll just put the subscribe thing up on screen with other videos and say thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you again soon.